Welcome to Bedtime Express, the sanctuary where ancient wisdom meets modern rest. I'm your guide for the night, and I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this moment with us. Tonight, you're about to embark on a timeless journey with the tale of Icarus and Daedalus, Wings of Freedom. Before you fall asleep, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your location and local time, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a soothing journey into rest and reflection. Your support helps us continue bringing you these curated stories and meditations. Tonight's bedtime story will take you to an immersive experience that explores the eternal story of a father and son who dared to dream of flying, who crafted wings of wax and feathers, and who discovered profound lessons about freedom, wisdom, and the delicate balance between ambition and love. As this story unfolds, I invite you to settle into a comfortable position, dim your lights, and let yourself fully surrender to this moment. There is nothing you need to do right now except breathe, relax, and allow the gentle rhythms of this tale to guide you towards sleep. Leave behind the worries of the day, the demands of tomorrow, and simply be present with this ancient wisdom. Now, take a deep breath, close your eyes if you wish, and prepare yourself for the flight. The wings await, the sky beckons, and the ancient tale of Icarus and Daedalus is ready to carry you gently into sleep. Let the journey begin now. The tale of Icarus and Daedalus, Wings of Freedom. Welcome, dear listener, to a story that has echoed through the corridors of time for thousands of years. This is not merely a tale of myth and legend, but a profound meditation on the bonds between parent and child, on the nature of freedom, and on the eternal tension between ambition and wisdom. As you settle into comfort, let your breath slow, let your shoulders release their tension, and allow yourself to drift into the ancient world of Crete, where our story begins. In the earliest light of dawn, when the sea still holds the memory of night, and the sky hesitates between darkness and day, there was a man named Daedalus. He was not a king, nor a god, nor a warrior celebrated in grand halls. Instead, he was a craftsman, perhaps the finest craftsman who had ever lived. His hands were those of an artist, marked by oil and ash, by the subtle scars of creation. When Daedalus worked, time seemed to bend around him. Hours would pass like minutes, and what emerged from his studio was nothing short of miraculous. Imagine, if you will, walking through the narrow streets of Athens in those distant days. The city would buzz with whispers of Daedalus, of the mechanical dove he had created that could actually fly, of the wooden cow so perfectly crafted that even the cleverest eye could not distinguish it from a living creature. Kings sought his services from across the Mediterranean, each believing that Daedalus's genius could solve their problems, could create wonders, could perhaps even bend the laws of nature itself. And Daedalus, in those earlier years, accepted their commissions with pride, allowing his ego to swell as large as his talent. But pride, as the ancient stories tell us, often carries a price. One day, Daedalus's nephew, a young man of great promise named Perdix, came to study under the master craftsman. The boy was brilliant, perhaps too brilliant, for he quickly grasped concepts that should have taken years to understand. He invented the saw by studying the spine of a fish. He created the compass from a simple scrap of metal. Where Daedalus took months, young Perdix seemed to accomplish in weeks. In Daedalus's heart, something dark began to grow. It was not merely jealousy, though that was certainly present. It was the terrible fear that he might be surpassed, that his legacy might be overshadowed, that his place as the greatest craftsman in the world might be stolen away. One evening, blinded by this rage and fear, Daedalus did something unforgivable. He murdered his nephew, pushing the boy from a cliff, and then claimed that Perdix had fallen by accident. But the gods see all, and they judge all. As punishment for this terrible crime, Daedalus was forced to flee Athens, hunted by the authorities, cast out from the only home he had known. His name became synonymous not with genius, but with darkness and shame. For years he wandered, moving from place to place, never able to truly settle, never able to forget what he had done. And in this exile, Daedalus had time to reflect, time to understand that his ambition, his pride, his need to be the greatest had cost him everything that mattered. It was during these years of wandering that Daedalus met a woman, and though the ancient texts tell us little of her, we know that they fell in love. From this union, a son was born, and Daedalus named him Icarus. When the baby first opened his eyes and looked up at his father, something shifted in Daedalus's heart. All the guilt, all the shame, all the ambition that had driven him to darkness, these things were suddenly recontextualized by the presence of this innocent child. Fatherhood is perhaps the first true test of redemption, and Daedalus vowed that he would be different for his son. He would use his gifts not for pride or dominion, but for love and protection. Years passed, and Daedalus raised his son with gentleness and care. He taught Icarus the names of stars, explaining how they move through the heavens in patterns that never change, yet somehow always seem new. He showed his son how water flows downhill, how fire reaches upward, how wood can be bent if treated with patience and heat. He held the boy's hand as they walked through markets and gardens, and in every moment, Daedalus was truly trying to atone for the darkness of his past by being a good father. Icarus grew strong and curious, with bright eyes that saw wonder in the simplest things. But then came the day that changed everything. King Minos of Crete, the most powerful ruler in the Mediterranean, summoned Daedalus to his palace. The king's summons could not be refused. It was less an invitation and more a command. Daedalus gathered young Icarus, who was now old enough to travel with his father, and together they made the journey across the sea to Crete. Neither of them knew that this journey would set them on a path toward both glory and tragedy, that it would test the bonds between father and son in ways they could not yet imagine. King Minos received them in his magnificent throne room, a vast chamber with marble columns and painted walls depicting great hunts and battles. The king explained his need. Somewhere on the island of Crete, hidden within a vast labyrinth of stone and passages, there lived a creature half man, half bull, known as the Minotaur. This beast had been born from an unholy union, and it was imprisoned in this maze so that it might never escape and destroy the kingdoms of men. King Minos wanted Daedalus to design and build this labyrinth, a maze so complex that no one who entered it could ever find their way out. The king would pay handsomely for this work, but there was a catch. Daedalus and his son would remain on the island, prisoners themselves, so that the secret of the labyrinth's design would never be revealed to others. Daedalus understood the situation immediately. He could refuse, but refusal meant death for himself and for his beloved son. He could accept, but acceptance meant imprisonment for life, trapped on an island far from home, cut off from the rest of the world. For a long moment, as Icarus watched his father's face, the boy could see the weight of this terrible choice pressing down on him. Then, slowly, Daedalus nodded his acceptance. What other choice did a father have? And so began their captivity. Daedalus threw himself into the work of designing and building the labyrinth with the full force of his genius. He carved passages that twisted back on themselves, created dead ends that seemed to open into further passages, designed the whole structure so that its logic could only be understood by the man who built it. It was a masterpiece of cruelty and ingenuity combined, and when the Minotaur was placed within it, even that fearsome beast could not escape the perfection of Daedalus's design. But each night, when the work was done and Daedalus returned to the small chamber where he and Icarus were confined, the craftsman looked at his son's face and felt the full weight of what he had done. Icarus was intelligent enough to understand their situation. He was not a child anymore, but a young man growing in wisdom and awareness. And though the boy never complained, though he never accused his father of choosing wrong, Daedalus could see it in his eyes, the longing for freedom, the hunger to see the world beyond the prison walls. In the darkness of those nights, Daedalus made a silent promise. He would find a way to free them both. He would not spend the rest of his life imprisoned, would not condemn his son to the same fate. But how? The island of Crete was surrounded on all sides by the sea, and King Minos' fleet of ships was the most powerful in the world. Escape by water was impossible. The king's guards would intercept any vessel that tried to leave the island. The mountains were high and treacherous, and they too were watched. Daedalus would lie awake at night, his mind working through problem after problem, each solution revealing a new obstacle, each escape route proving impossible. His genius, which had always served him before, seemed inadequate to this challenge. And then, one evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, inspiration struck. He was standing on the cliff above the palace, looking out at the vast expanse of sky, when it came to him. The sea was blocked, the land was blocked, but the sky had no walls, no guards, no gates that could be closed. The birds flew free above Crete every day, soaring on currents of air, traveling vast distances without any king's permission. What if man could do the same? What if he could create wings, artificial wings made from materials that could actually bear the weight of a human body? It was an impossible idea, perhaps the most impossible idea Daedalus had ever conceived. For centuries, men had watched birds with envy and longing, had dreamed of flight, had created myths and legends about beings who could soar through the air, but none had ever succeeded. The human body was too heavy, the forces required too great, the challenge too fundamental. And yet, Daedalus was not bound by the limitations that constrained ordinary men. His hands had crafted impossible things before. His mind had solved problems that should have been unsolvable. Perhaps this too was within the reach of his genius. That night, Daedalus spoke to his son for the first time about the plan that was forming in his mind. He explained his vision: wings made of wax and feathers, carefully constructed and balanced, that might allow them to escape Crete by taking to the air itself. He expected Icarus to think him mad, to dismiss the idea as the fantasy of a desperate man. But instead, the young man's eyes grew bright with hope. Freedom, real freedom, suddenly seemed possible, not merely as a distant dream, but as something that could be achieved through his father's brilliance and their combined determination. Icarus embraced his father that night, and in that embrace was all the love and trust a son can hold for a parent. And so began the greatest project of Daedalus's life, not the construction of a prison, but the creation of a key to freedom. Using materials carefully collected over months of planning, feathers gathered from birds that flew near their prison, wax melted from candles, string and wood carved in secret, Daedalus began to construct the wings. He worked in the darkness of their chamber after the guards had passed, his hands moving with the certainty of decades of craft, his mind fully engaged in the challenge of translating the freedom of birds into something that human beings could use. And beside him, sometimes helping with small tasks, but more often simply sitting in quiet companionship, was Icarus. These nights of creation brought father and son even closer together, their bond strengthened by shared purpose and shared hope. Weeks passed, and gradually the wings took shape. Daedalus tested and refined them endlessly, adjusting the weight distribution, repositioning the feathers, strengthening the joins between wax and frame. He had to make 2 pairs, one for himself and one for his son, and while he created Icarus's wings, he thought constantly about the responsibility he was taking on. He was giving his son the means to escape, but also placing him in danger. Flight was an unknown territory. Anything could go wrong. Yet the alternative, remaining prisoners in Crete for the rest of their lives, seemed like a slow death, a betrayal of everything that Icarus deserved from his father. When the wings were finally complete, Daedalus sat with his son and explained to him the gravity of what they were about to attempt. His voice was slow and measured, and Icarus listened with the seriousness of a young man understanding that his entire future hung in the balance. Daedalus held the wings up to the light of their single candle, the feathers catching the glow and seeming to shimmer with possibility and danger combined. On the night before their planned escape, neither Daedalus nor Icarus could sleep. The gods outside their chamber had settled into routine, and the palace around them was quiet, wrapped in the darkness of deep night. But inside their room, 2 minds were racing with anticipation and fear. Daedalus sat by the small window, looking out at the stars, while Icarus lay on his thin mattress, staring at nothing, his heart beating in an irregular rhythm that mirrored the racing of his thoughts. Finally, Daedalus spoke, breaking the long silence. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything he had learned in his long life. "Tomorrow we take to the air, my son," he said slowly, choosing each word with care. "Tomorrow we escape this prison, and we begin our journey back to freedom, back to a world that has almost forgotten we exist." He paused, letting these words settle in the darkness between them. "But before we fly, there are things you must understand, things that are more important than the wings themselves." Icarus rose from his bed and came to sit beside his father. In the dim starlight, the young man's face was a portrait of trust and eagerness, the bright enthusiasm of youth not yet tempered by the harsh lessons of experience. Daedalus looked at this face, a face that was slowly beginning to resemble his own more and more as the boy grew into a man, and he felt the full weight of his responsibility as a father, a teacher, a guide. "The wings I have created for you are made from the most delicate materials," Daedalus began, his words coming slowly like honey dripping from a jar. "The feathers are held together with wax, not the wax of hardened stone, but wax that remains sensitive to heat and to cold, to dampness and to drought." He turned to look directly into his son's eyes, and there was a depth of meaning in his gaze that went far beyond the literal words he was speaking. "This wax is essential to your flight, Icarus, but it is also fragile." He held up a feather, and it caught the starlight, seeming almost translucent, impossibly delicate. "The first rule you must follow," Daedalus continued, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality, almost like poetry, "is this: you must not fly too high." He paused, letting these words hang in the air between them like a challenge. The sun, my son, is a mighty force, beautiful and life-giving. Yes, but also terrible and consuming. Daedalus gestured upward, toward where the sun would appear in a few hours, though now only stars occupied that space. If you climb too close to the sun, its heat will melt the wax that binds your wings together, and the feathers will fall away, and you will fall from the sky like a stone dropped into the sea. Icarus listened intently, and though he did not speak, Daedalus could see the boy processing this information, imagining the scenario his father was describing. The young man's eyes held a mixture of understanding and uncertainty. He grasped the danger intellectually, but perhaps did not yet fully comprehend the reality of what it would mean to experience such a fall. This was the eternal gap between youth and age, between the theoretical knowledge of danger and the deep embodied understanding that comes only from experience. But that is not all, Daedalus went on, and now his voice became even softer, more thoughtful. There is a second rule, perhaps even more important than the first, though it is less dramatic, less immediately obvious why you must follow it. He leaned closer to his son, his old eyes searching the young man's face. You must not fly too low. He allowed a moment of silence to pass, watching Icarus's expression shift, watching the young man try to understand this equally puzzling command. The sea below is vast and endless, Daedalus explained, and now his words seemed to paint a picture, creating a scene in the darkness between them. The spray that rises from its surface is filled with salt and moisture, and this dampness will soak into your feathers, will weigh them down, will make your wings heavy and waterlogged. He held his hands before him, as if demonstrating the gradual absorption of water, the slow increase in weight. If you descend too low, if you allow the sea spray to soak your wings, they will become too heavy for you to lift yourself back up. He paused significantly. You will fall into the sea, and even my greatest genius cannot save you from those waters. A long silence followed these words. Icarus sat very still, his young mind grasping the parameters of his freedom. He was to have the sky, yes, but only a narrow corridor of it, bounded above by the sun's deadly heat, and below by the sea's patient weight. It was freedom, but it was freedom circumscribed by danger and by limits. Between these two dangers, Daedalus said quietly, lies your path to safety. He gestured with his hands, drawing an invisible line through the air between them. Not too high, not too low, but right there in the middle, where the air is gentle and the way is clear. He turned to look at his son with great earnestness. This middle way, Icarus, is wisdom. He repeated the word slowly. Wisdom, not the obvious dramatic wisdom that comes from avoiding great spectacles, but the subtle, constant wisdom of maintaining balance, of knowing your limits, of understanding that safety often lies not in the extreme, but in the steady mean. Icarus nodded slowly, and Daedalus could see that the boy was taking these teachings into his heart. The young man reached out and touched his father's arm, a gesture of connection and reassurance. "I understand, Father," he said, and his voice was calm and measured in a way that made Daedalus believe that truly. The boy did understand, or at least understood to the degree that a young man still untested by the real world could understand. "There is more," Daedalus said, and he stood now, moving to where the wings lay in the shadows of the room. He lifted Icarus's wings carefully, the feathers rustling softly as they caught the air. "These wings are not separate from you, my son." He held them out so that Icarus could see them fully. "They are an extension of your will and your determination." He paused, choosing his next words with great care, as if each one were precious and not to be wasted. "Just as a bird must trust its wings, you must learn to trust yours, not with blind faith, but with the informed trust that comes from understanding how they work, respecting their limitations, and working in harmony with them." Daedalus showed his son how to strap the wings securely to his arms, how to balance them to maintain stability, how to angle them to catch the wind. He explained the mechanics of flight, how the wings must cut through the air, how momentum and balance must be maintained, how the body must work in concert with the feathers and wax to achieve and sustain movement through space. As he taught these things, his voice never rose in excitement or urgency. Instead, it remained calm and steady, like a meditation, like a prayer. "Once we leave this chamber tomorrow," Daedalus said as he finished his instruction, "you must not separate from me." This was perhaps the most important thing he had said all night. No matter what you see, no matter how beautiful the sky seems, no matter how great your desire to explore it fully, you must stay with me. He placed both hands on Icarus's shoulders, and his old eyes held his son's gaze with an intensity that burned away any possibility of misunderstanding. "Stray from the path, and I cannot help you." He repeated this with emphasis. "I cannot help you, and I would not wish the alternative on you, not for anything in this world." Icarus embraced his father tightly, and in that embrace was all the love between them, all the years they had spent together, all the sacrifices Daedalus had made for his son, and all the trust that Icarus placed in his father. When they separated, both had tears on their faces, though neither spoke of them. The time for words had passed. They lay down to sleep for the last time in their prison, and though neither felt truly restful, there was a peace in their hearts, the peace that comes from knowing that action is at last to be taken, that waiting is nearly over, that tomorrow their lives would change irrevocably for better or for worse. And as sleep finally claimed them, their dreams were filled with sky and wind and freedom. Morning came gradually, as morning always does, first a lightening of the darkness, then the faintest blush of color on the horizon, then the full dawn, with its light spreading across the sea like spilled gold. Daedalus and Icarus woke without speaking, each aware of what the day would bring. They moved in silence, preparing themselves for the flight that would either save them or destroy them. There was no contingency plan, no backup strategy, no safe option if things went wrong. This was the point at which commitment became absolute, the moment at which there was no turning back. They strapped on the wings in the dim morning light, the process taking on an almost ceremonial quality. Daedalus fastened Icarus's wings first, checking each connection carefully, ensuring that everything was secure and properly balanced. Then Icarus, with shaking hands, helped his father into his own wings, doing for his father what had been done for him. It was a moment of beautiful symmetry, father and son, each trusting the other with their life. When both were ready, Daedalus moved to the window of their chamber. It was a high window, high enough that they had a clear view of the sky and the sea, high enough that they could gain the altitude necessary to catch the wind currents that would carry them away from Crete. Daedalus looked at his son one final time. His old face was calm, resolved, bearing the weight of all his experience and all his responsibility. "Stay with me," he said simply, the same words he had used the night before. Icarus nodded, his young face a mixture of courage and uncertainty, the face of one standing at the threshold of a great adventure. And then, together, father and son stepped out into the morning air, their artificial wings spread wide to catch the wind. For a moment, gravity seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to claim them or release them. And then, impossibly, miraculously, they were flying. The earth fell away beneath them, and the sky opened up all around them, vast and beautiful and dangerous and free. The first few moments of flight were unlike anything either Daedalus or Icarus could have imagined. There is a fundamental shift that occurs when a human being leaves the earth and enters the realm of the sky. The world below transforms from the concrete reality of daily life into something dreamlike and abstract, something that exists in a different register altogether. The palace of King Minos, which had seemed so vast and imposing when Daedalus and Icarus were within it, shrank to the size of a child's toy from this new vantage point. The streets of Crete, which had been their entire world, became thin lines on a canvas of brown earth. Daedalus flew steadily and carefully, maintaining his altitude with the precision of long practice, for though he had never flown before, his mind had already flown this journey 1,000 times, working out every detail, anticipating every challenge. His wings moved with a rhythmic precision that seemed to defy the impossibility of what was happening. Behind him, or perhaps more accurately beside him and slightly below, for they flew in formation rather than one directly behind the other, came Icarus. The young man was exhilarating in his flight, perhaps too exhilarated. Icarus had never been constrained by the decades of restraint and caution that had shaped his father's character. Where Daedalus's movements were economical and precise, Icarus's were more exuberant, more eager to test the limits of what these wings could do. The young man was discovering something that his father had theorized but never fully experienced: the profound joy of flying. The way that the wind seems to lift not just your body but your spirit itself. The way that freedom becomes not merely an idea but a physical sensation coursing through every nerve. "Father," Icarus called out, his voice bright with wonder and excitement. "Is it not extraordinary?" He rolled his wings slightly, testing how the device responded to subtle changes in angle, discovering the relationship between his will and the movement of the air around him. "I never imagined, I never could have imagined." His words tumbled over each other in his eagerness to express the inexpressible. Daedalus heard his son's voice and felt a complicated mixture of emotions. There was pride, profound pride, in his own accomplishment, in the fact that his hands and his mind had created something that made this impossible thing possible. But there was also concern, a small warning bell sounding in the back of his mind as he observed his son's growing confidence and exhilaration. "Stay with me," he called back, repeating the instruction he had given so many times already. "Maintain your altitude and your course." They flew across the water, leaving behind them the island of Crete and all the pain and captivity it represented. Below them, the sea stretched out in all its vastness, its surface moving in patterns that had no beginning and no end, that had existed long before men learned to dream of flying and would exist long after. The color of the water seemed to shift as they flew, sometimes deep blue, sometimes green, sometimes showing hints of purple in the deeper places. It was beautiful, achingly beautiful, and Icarus could not seem to look away from it. The morning wore on, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. Daedalus could feel the increased warmth of its rays on his back, could sense the wax beginning to feel slightly softer as the ambient temperature around him grew warmer. This was not yet a danger. He was still maintaining a safe altitude, still staying on his prescribed path, but it was a reminder of the warning he had given his son. The sun was not yet close enough to be a threat, but it was closer than before, and it would continue to be closer as the day progressed. But Icarus did not seem to notice these subtleties, or if he did not allow them to temper his exhilaration. The young man began to experiment more boldly with his flight. He angled his wings steeper, testing how higher altitudes felt, discovering that the air became thinner and cooler as he climbed. The experience seemed to intoxicate him with joy, the sense that the sky was his to explore, that years of captivity had prepared him for this moment of complete freedom, that the rules and constraints that had bound him on the earth need not apply here. "Icarus," Daedalus called out, his voice sharper now, carrying a note of warning. "Do not stray from the course we have set." But his son either did not hear him or chose not to hear him, so caught up was he in the pure pleasure of his newfound freedom. There is a particular vulnerability that comes with being a father watching your child choose their own path, especially when you can see the danger that your child cannot yet perceive. It is a helplessness that is perhaps unique to parenthood, this inability to fully protect those you love most, this necessity of sometimes allowing them to learn lessons you desperately wish they did not have to learn. As the morning continued and the sun climbed higher, Daedalus found himself flying with increasing concern. Icarus was still maintaining roughly the correct altitude, but his trajectory had become less stable, more erratic, as if he were playing with the wind rather than simply riding it as a means to an end. The young man was performing what might almost be called aerial acrobatics, banking sharply, diving quickly only to pull up again, testing the maximum speed his wings could achieve. And with each of these experiments, he drifted a little higher, pulled a little closer to the burning disk of the Sunday. Daedalus tried to call to his son repeatedly, tried to warn him, tried to reinstate the rules that had been so carefully laid out the night before. But the wind that carried them also seemed to carry away his words, or at least to dilute them, making them seem less urgent, less real than the immediate experience of flight itself. The distance between father and son seemed to grow as Icarus climbed higher and higher, drawn upward by a force that had nothing to do with the mechanics of wind and wings. What was drawing Icarus higher was the same force that draws all young people upward and outward, the irresistible pull of possibility, the seductive whisper that says, "You are stronger than you think, cleverer than you believe, more capable than anyone has told you." It was the voice of youth itself, that eternal voice that looks at all the warnings and constraints of age and says, "Perhaps those rules were made for ordinary people, but I am not ordinary." And in a way, Icarus was not ordinary. He was the son of Daedalus, the greatest craftsman who had ever lived, and in his veins ran the blood of genius. Could it not be that he too possessed talents and abilities that exceeded the normal limitations of men? Could it not be that he might safely go where his father feared to tread? At midday, when the sun reached its apex, when its heat was most intense and most direct, Daedalus finally managed to catch up with his son, or rather, Icarus finally slowed his ascent enough that his father could draw near. What Daedalus saw in that moment would remain etched in his memory for the rest of his life. Icarus was flying with an almost dreamy quality now, his movements slower than before, as if he were moving through a medium more viscous than air. And Daedalus could see the problem immediately. Small feathers were beginning to fall away from his son's wings, drifting down toward the sea far below like snowflakes on a warm day. "Icarus!" Daedalus cried out, and now his voice contained not just warning but desperate urgency. "You must descend! You must come down now!" He reached out with one hand, trying to grab his son, trying to physically pull the young man back toward safety, but the air between them seemed to stretch the distance rather than close it. The laws of flight, which had been so cooperative moments before, now seemed to conspire against reunion, as if the sky itself understood what was about to happen and wanted to keep father and son apart for what was to come. Icarus seemed to suddenly comprehend what was occurring, and in that moment his exhilaration turned to terror. The wax holding his wings together, the wax that his father had warned him about so carefully the night before, was melting, was releasing its hold on the carefully arranged feathers, was failing in its essential function. The young man looked down at his wings with shock and disbelief, as if he could not quite accept that what his father had warned of was actually happening. "Father!" he cried out, and there was a raw vulnerability in his voice now, all the bravado and exhilaration stripped away, replaced by the pure fear of one who suddenly understands their own mortality, their own vulnerability, their own terrible smallness in the face of the vast and uncaring universe. "Hold steady," Daedalus called back, and now his voice carried the authority of a father trying desperately to save his child's life. "Keep your wings level. Try to descend slowly, carefully, do not panic." But even as he gave these instructions, Daedalus knew that panic was all but inevitable, that the instructions were more for his own benefit than for his son's, a way of trying to exert some small control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. The feathers continued to fall from Icarus's wings like leaves from a tree in autumn, drifting down and down and down toward the distant water below. With each feather that fell away, Icarus's flight became more unstable, more difficult to control, more desperate and futile. The young man's movements, which had been so graceful and confident just moments before, became frantic and panicked, and this panic only accelerated the process of disintegration. As Icarus thrashed about, the remaining feathers loosened further, until finally, with a sound like the last breath leaving a dying person, the wings began to fail completely. Daedalus watched his son fall, watched him plummet toward the sea, watched the distance between them increase from meters to tens of meters to hundreds of meters in what felt like only seconds. He wanted to look away but could not, just as one cannot look away from a tragedy unfolding before one's eyes. In that moment, all of Daedalus's wisdom, all of his talent, all of his genius was utterly powerless. The greatest craftsman in the world could not craft a way to undo what had been done, could not redesign the laws of physics to save his son, could not alter the terrible mathematics of gravity and acceleration that governed the fall of bodies through space. For a long moment, Daedalus hung suspended in the air, his wings still carrying him, still functioning perfectly, and this perfection felt like an obscenity. His creation was working exactly as designed, except for the fact that it was only keeping him alive, only maintaining his flight, while his son fell to his death beneath him. The old craftsman watched as the small figure that was Icarus grew smaller and smaller, watched as the wings he had so carefully constructed fell away in pieces, watched until finally his sun struck the water far below. There was no great splash, no dramatic final moment. Icarus simply became another piece of flotsam in the vast indifference of the sea, one more body swallowed by waters that had swallowed countless others and would swallow countless more in the long years to come. And above, Daedalus continued to fly, his wings beating steadily, his body suspended impossibly in the air, while his heart descended into depths of grief that seemed bottomless. Daedalus did not attempt to fly down to where his son had fallen. There was no point, he understood, with the bitter clarity of someone who had just learned a terrible lesson, that Icarus was gone, that no human effort could recover him now. Instead, the old man simply flew on, his movements becoming mechanical, devoid of the purposeful direction they had possessed moments before. He flew across the sky in a daze, aware of his surroundings in only the most superficial way, aware that he was still alive, aware that his wings were still functioning, aware that the terrible irony was that his greatest triumph, the creation of human flight, was now forever tainted by his greatest tragedy. Hours passed in a blur of pain and numbness combined, and finally Daedalus saw land on the horizon not Crete, which he had left so far behind, but another island, a place of safety and refuge. He landed clumsily, his careful precision abandoned, and he fell to his knees on the warm sand, his wings still strapped to his body, still ready for flight, still mocking him with their functionality. He tore them from his body with violent, anguished gestures, and he threw them aside, unable to bear the sight of them any longer. And there, on a beach far from home, in a land that bore no meaning for him, Daedalus wept not with the quiet tears of a man facing adversity, but with deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place beyond tears, from the deepest well of a father's grief and guilt. Many days passed before Daedalus felt ready to move from the island where he had landed. He had found a small village there, simple people who asked few questions and seemed content to let a grief-stricken old man occupy a corner of their community without demanding much of him. They gave him shelter, they gave him food. They left him largely alone, and for this kindness Daedalus was grateful. Gratitude, however, was complicated by the fact that he felt he deserved no kindness, that he should perhaps have fallen from the sky along with his son rather than continuing to live in a world that Icarus would never see again. Each morning, Daedalus would wake in the small room they had given him, and for a few blessed moments before full consciousness returned, he would forget what had happened. In those moments, the world was still whole, his son was still alive, and the tragedy that had shaped his later years had not yet occurred. And then, like clockwork, the realization would return the full weight of it crashing down upon him with fresh force, as if it were happening for the first time. It is often said that the pain of grief lessens with time, But Daedalus learned that this is not entirely true. Rather, grief transforms, changes its shape, becomes easier to carry perhaps, but never truly disappears. He spent hours sitting on the beach, looking out at the sea, wondering if the water had returned his son's body to shore somewhere, or if Icarus remained suspended in the depths, part of the ocean's vast collection of the drowned. Daedalus would search the waves as they came in, as if his son might emerge from them whole and alive, and laugh about the whole terrible misunderstanding. Of course, this never happened, but hope that terrible, resilient, unwelcome companion died hard. One afternoon, when the light was beginning to soften toward evening, a fisherman came walking along the beach, his net slung over his shoulder. The man sat down beside Daedalus without speaking, and they remained together in silence for a long time, watching the sun descend toward the horizon. Finally, the fisherman spoke, and his voice was gentle, without pity but without judgment. "You lost someone," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Daedalus did not respond immediately, but after a long pause, he nodded slowly. "My son," he finally said, and the words seemed strange in his mouth, seemed to belong to a language he had forgotten how to speak. "I lost my son." The fisherman nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already understood. "I have lost sons as well," he said quietly. "The sea takes many sons, sometimes through storms, sometimes through foolishness, sometimes simply through the random cruelty of the world." He paused, looking out at the water with the particular wisdom that comes to those who spend their lives in intimate contact with forces beyond their control. But the sea also gives back, sometimes in unexpected ways. "I gave him wings," Daedalus said, and now there was a note of bitterness in his voice, a self-recrimination that was almost violent in its intensity. "I gave him the ability to fly, to escape, to be free from the prison that held us both." He turned to look at the fisherman with eyes that held such torment that it was almost difficult to look directly at them. "And in doing so, I gave him a way to die that he would never have had otherwise." The fisherman was quiet for a long time, considering his response with the care of one who understands that certain words, once spoken, cannot be taken back. Finally he said, "Did you give your son wings so that he would die?" The question was simple, almost naive, but it contained within it a deep wisdom. "No," Daedalus admitted. "I gave him wings so that he would live, so that we both would live." "Then you did what a father should do," the fisherman said. "You gave your son the means to live, the means to be free, the means to fly from his captivity." He paused, and then he added quietly, "That your son chose to fly too high was not your doing, though I understand that it feels that way." These words, meant kindly, struck Daedalus like a blow. "I warned him," he said, and his voice was hoarse with pain. I warned him specifically, carefully. I explained the danger, and he understood, or I thought he understood, and yet still he flew too high. Still he ignored my warnings, and in doing so he died. Daedalus stood up abruptly, unable to bear the conversation any longer, unable to bear the suggestion that he should forgive himself for something that felt fundamentally unforgivable. The fisherman did not attempt to stop him, but as Daedalus walked away, the old man called after him, "The hardest wisdom we must learn is that we cannot force others to be wise, even those we love most, even our own children." His words followed Daedalus across the beach, and though the old craftsman tried to ignore them, they lodged themselves in his mind, and he found himself turning them over and over in the days that followed, examining them from every angle, as if they were a gem he had found, and was trying to determine its true value. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, very slowly, something began to shift within Daedalus. It did not happen suddenly, did not arrive as an epiphany or a revelation, but rather as a slow erosion of the hardest edges of his guilt and self-recrimination, like water gradually wearing away stone. He began to understand, not to forgive himself entirely, for that seemed impossible, but to understand that the responsibility for Icarus's death did not rest entirely on his shoulders. His son had been a young man, growing into his own mind and his own will, and at some point a father must accept that he cannot control what his child chooses to do, no matter how carefully he teaches, no matter how thoroughly he explains the dangers. This understanding brought no relief, but it brought something else, a kind of peace, perhaps, or the beginnings of peace. A peace that came from accepting that he had done what he could, had taught what he knew to teach, and that the rest lay beyond the boundaries of his control and responsibility. This is the terrible, necessary wisdom that comes to all parents eventually, the realization that you cannot save your children from every danger, that sometimes the very things that free them are the same things that can harm them, and that ultimately each person must walk their own path and face their own consequences, however painful that might be for those who love them. One day, Daedalus constructed a monument on the beach where he had fallen, not far from where he had first sat in his grief. It was simple, made of stones that he gathered from the shore, arranged in such a way as to form a marker, a memorial to the young man who had loved flight and freedom more than he had loved the warnings of his aging father. And when he had finished this work, Daedalus sat down beside it and spoke to his son, not believing that Icarus could hear him, not believing in any form of afterlife or spiritual communication, but speaking to him nonetheless, because words had been his craft and remained his inheritance. "I would not ask you to forgive me," Daedalus said to the stone monument, to the empty air, to the ghost of his son that existed now only in his memory and his imagination. "I know that you cannot, that wherever you are, if anywhere, You are beyond the reach of such requests and reconciliations." He paused, his old voice growing softer, almost inaudible above the sound of the waves. "But I want you to know that I have tried to understand why you did what you did, why you were drawn upward despite my warnings, why the freedom of the sky seemed more important than the safety of following the path I had set." He was quiet for a long time, and then he continued, "And I think that I understand it now." His voice carried a weight of hard-won wisdom, the wisdom of one who has spent months in the deepest grief and has come, at last, to some kind of understanding. You were young, and you were beautiful, and you had just been freed from a prison that had held you your entire life. He paused, and a small, sad smile crossed his face, the first smile that had visited him since that terrible day. "How could I have expected you to be cautious? How could I have expected you to be satisfied with merely the middle way, with the safe path, with the compromise between earth and sky?" He shook his head slowly. "I could not have, and perhaps deep in my heart, I did not want you to be cautious. Perhaps I wanted you to fly higher than I ever could, to reach places that age and experience had made impossible for me." Daedalus realized as he spoke these words that this too was part of the terrible truth of what had happened, not just his responsibility, but his ambitions, his secret desires for his son to exceed him, to surpass his limitations, to achieve things that would make the father's accomplishments seem small by comparison. And in encouraging this, in allowing it, in not being harsh enough in his warnings, because part of him wanted to see his son become everything that he himself could never be in this, Daedalus too had played a role in what had occurred. This realization might have plunged him back into guilt and despair, but instead it had the opposite effect. For in accepting his own role not just as the creator of the wings, but as the dreamer of the dream that the wings represented, Daedalus began to accept the whole terrible beauty of what had happened. His son had died pursuing freedom, pursuing flight, pursuing the highest reaches of what was possible. There was tragedy in this, certainly, but there was also a kind of strange nobility. Icarus had not died in captivity or in mediocrity. He had died reaching for the sun, flying higher than he should have, pursuing the impossible. And perhaps, Daedalus thought, perhaps that was not such a terrible way to go when all was considered. In the years that followed, Daedalus built a life in this small island village. The people there came to respect him, to understand that while he was marked by a great grief, this grief had refined him rather than destroyed him. He became a teacher, passing on the knowledge he had accumulated over his long life to young people who came to learn from him. But he was different now than he had been before, less concerned with creating monuments to his own genius, less driven by the need to be recognized as the greatest craftsman, more focused on imparting knowledge, on helping others understand not just the how of creation, but the why and the dangers and possibilities inherent in any act of making something new. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars were particularly bright, Daedalus would stand on the beach and look up at the sky, at the vast expanse of darkness punctuated by points of light, and he would think of his son, not with the sharp pain that had once defined his grief, but with a kind of melancholy fondness, a remembrance that was also a kind of love. And he would whisper into that darkness, "Fly well, my son, wherever you are, whatever has become of you." And in his heart, he believed that somehow, in some way that transcended death and the limitations of the physical world, his son was indeed flying still, reaching for heights that no one had ever reached before him, pursuing dreams that no one had ever dreamed before, free at last from all the constraints and limitations and warnings that his father had tried so carefully to impose. Many years passed, and Daedalus grew old, older than he might have expected to grow, given the circumstances that might have claimed his life. His hair turned white, and his hands began to shake slightly with the tremor of age. But his mind remained sharp, his wisdom continued to deepen, and he became known throughout many islands and lands as a sage, a teacher, a man who understood both the possibilities and the limitations of human ambition. People came from distant places to study with him, to learn from his experience, to hear the stories that he told in his slow, thoughtful voice about the nature of creation and the weight of consequences. And always, eventually, they would ask him about Icarus. They would ask about the boy who had flown too high, about the wings of wax and feathers, about the tragedy that had shaped his later life. And Daedalus would tell them the story not with bitterness, not with attempts at self-justification, but with a deep, patient wisdom that seemed to contain within it all the lessons of his long life. One afternoon, when Daedalus was very old indeed, a young scholar came to him with a question that was both simple and profound. "Master," the young man asked, "if you had to choose knowing what you now know, would you create the wings again? Would you attempt the escape, knowing that it would cost your son his life?" Daedalus was quiet for a long time, and his old eyes seemed to look not at the young man before him, but at something far distant, something visible only to those who have lived as long as he had and accumulated such depths of experience. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was soft but clear, carrying the authority of a man who had wrestled with this very question 1,000 times and had come to some kind of understanding. "This is the question that every parent must eventually answer," Daedalus said slowly. "Not in words, perhaps, but in the choices they make and the lives they lead." He paused, choosing his words with the care of one who understands that certain truths are difficult to speak and must be approached gradually, like approaching a flame without being burned. "If I had refused to build the wings, if I had accepted our imprisonment in Crete, then my son would be alive still, or at least he might be alive still. He held up a hand, forestalling the young man's immediate assumption that this meant he should not have built the wings. But he would be alive in captivity, alive in a prison, alive but not free. The old craftsman stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, and walked to the window where he could see the sea. A human being who is not free is like a bird with clipped wings, he continued, his voice carrying the weight of deep conviction. They may continue to breathe, may continue to move through the world, may even find moments of joy and comfort, but something essential within them has been violated. Something fundamental has been taken away. He turned back to look at the young scholar. To live in captivity is to live a half-life, a truncated life, a life that cannot fully express what it means to be human, is less than #2. 0 hash is greater than, but surely, the young man ventured, surely a half-life is better than no life at all. Daedalus's eyes held a mixture of compassion and sorrow at this question that revealed how the young man still viewed life as a simple binary, the presence of breath and heartbeat measured against their absence. When you are young, you may believe that, Daedalus said. When you have not yet tasted freedom, when you have not yet felt the wind beneath your wings or the sun warm upon your face, you may believe that any life is better than death. He returned to his chair and sat down, the effort seeming to cost him something. But I am here to tell you that this is not always true, that there are fates worse than death, that there is a kind of living death that is far more terrible than the quick, dark silence that comes when life finally ends. He was quiet for a moment, and then he continued in a voice that had become almost dreamy, almost as if he were speaking not to the young man before him, but to someone else, or to his own younger self across the span of decades. So yes, knowing what I know now, having experienced the terrible grief of losing my son, I would build the wings again. He said this with absolute certainty, and there was no wavering in his voice, no uncertainty, no sense that he was trying to convince himself or the young man of something he only half believed. I would build them again and again and again, for as many times as it would take, because the alternative, the slow suffocation of the human spirit under the weight of captivity, is something that I could not and would not accept, not even to avoid the tragedy that came to pass. The young scholar seemed troubled by this answer, seemed to want Daedalus to express some regret, some sense that he had made the wrong choice. But the old man's face held no such regret. Instead, there was acceptance, deep, hard-won acceptance of what had happened and why it had to happen the way it did. But there is a lesson here, Daedalus said, and now his voice became more animated, as if the teaching moment had energized him despite his advanced age. And it is not, as many believe, a lesson about the foolishness of ambition or the danger of flying too high. He leaned forward slightly, his old eyes intense and focused, The lesson is far more subtle and far more important than that. The young man waited, attentive, sensing that what was to come was important. The lesson, Daedalus said slowly, is that we must never, ever attempt to control others through rules and restrictions alone. He held up one hand, counting off on his fingers. I gave my son rules important, vital rules that were meant to keep him safe. I told him not to fly too high, not to fly too low, to stay on a middle path. He paused significantly, and he did not listen, because he was young and he was free, and the call of the sky was stronger than the voice of his aging father, warning him of dangers he could not yet fully comprehend. Does this mean that the warnings were foolish? He asked, not waiting for an answer, but continuing immediately. No, the warnings were not foolish. Warnings are always necessary, always important, but it means that I placed too much faith in the power of words alone to govern behavior. He stood up again, and there was a kind of restless energy in his movements despite his age. A human being, especially a young human being, cannot be controlled by rules alone, cannot be governed by warnings alone, cannot be kept safe through the force of another's will. He walked to the window again, looking out at the sea, and his voice took on a philosophical quality, as if he were musing aloud rather than directly instructing. A bird learns not to fly too high into fire, not through being told by other birds, but through the painful experience of being burned. He paused and then added, but this knowledge comes at a terrible cost, and sometimes tragically, heartbreakingly, sometimes the cost is their life. He turned back to the young scholar. So the question becomes, how does a parent, how does a teacher, how does anyone who has responsibility for another balance the need to warn about dangers with the need to allow the person to fly free and discover their own limits? He sat back down, and there was a profound weariness in his movements now, not physical weariness so much as the weariness of one who has carried a heavy question for a very long time. I do not have a perfect answer to this question, though I have had many years to contemplate it. He looked directly at the young man now, and his gaze seemed to search for something in the younger person's face. But I will tell you what I have learned through the tragedy and grief of my life. First, warnings are necessary, but they are not sufficient. A person must eventually be allowed to test their own wings, to discover their own limits, to make their own mistakes. He held up a second finger. Second, the greatest gift we can give to those we love is not safety. Safety is often an illusion, an impossible dream that we cling to because accepting the fragility and danger inherent in existence is too difficult. He paused significantly. The greatest gift we can give is freedom, even knowing, especially knowing that freedom carries danger with it. He held up a third finger. And third, we must accept that we cannot control the outcomes of the choices we help others make. We can guide, we can warn, We can suggest the middle path, but in the end, each person must choose their own flight, and we must accept whatever consequences their choices bring. The young scholar sat very still, absorbing these words, trying to reconcile them with everything he had been taught about responsibility and care and the proper way to guide others. "But doesn't this mean that we might as well do nothing?" he asked. "If warnings are not sufficient and we cannot control outcomes, why try to guide at all?" Daedalus smiled a small, sad smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Ah, now you have discovered the paradox at the heart of all human relationship, all human responsibility, all human love." He settled back in his chair, and there was a sense of peace about him now, as if by articulating the paradox, he had made peace with it. We must try, even knowing that our trying may not be sufficient, that our guidance may not be followed, that our loved ones may fall from the sky despite everything we do to protect them. He paused, and his voice became very quiet. We must try, not because we are guaranteed success, but because trying itself is an expression of love, and love is ultimately what ties us to one another. "So my son fell," he continued, and now he was looking not at the young man but out the window, back toward the sea where Icarus had fallen so many years before. "My son flew too high despite my warnings, and he fell, and he died." His voice carried no bitterness, only a kind of acceptance that seemed to contain within it all the tears he had cried, all the grief he had experienced, all the slow, painful work of making sense of the senseless. But in his brief moment of flight, in those moments before the wax melted and the feathers fell away, Icarus experienced something that no human being in the entire history of the world had experienced before him. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with a kind of pride that went beyond vanity or ambition, a pride that seemed instead to be rooted in deep understanding and hard-won wisdom. He experienced freedom, true freedom, the freedom of flight, the freedom to push beyond all limits, the freedom to reach for the sun itself. "And he died," the young scholar said quietly, "reaching for the Sunday." "Yes," Daedalus agreed. "He died reaching for the Sunday." And there was no regret in his voice now, only acceptance and a kind of melancholy peace. "And I have come to understand that this is not a tragedy in the way that death in a prison would have been a tragedy, not a failure in the way that a life lived, half-lived, would have been a failure." He turned to look at the young man one more time, and his old eyes held all the wisdom that decades of grief and reflection had accumulated. "My son died, yes, but he died free. He died having experienced something extraordinary. He died pursuing his own path, making his own choices, flying toward his own horizon." He paused. "Is this not in its way a kind of victory?" And so Daedalus lived out his days on that distant island, growing older but not weaker in spirit, becoming a legend whose influence spread far beyond the small beach where he had first landed in his grief. The story of Icarus and Daedalus, of the father and son, and the wings of wax and feathers, traveled across the sea, from island to island, from trader to traveler, from generation to generation. And as the story traveled, it transformed, as all stories do, becoming sometimes a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, sometimes an inspiring story about the courage to attempt the impossible, sometimes a meditation on the bonds between parent and child, and the delicate balance between freedom and safety. For thousands of years, the story has been told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, and yet it has never lost its essential power to move and to teach. And this is perhaps because the story is not really about flying at all, not really about wings of wax and feathers or the mechanics of escape from captivity. Rather, it is about something far more universal, far more fundamental to the human condition. It is about the eternal tension between those who wish to protect and those who wish to be free, between the wisdom that comes from age and experience and the courage that comes from youth and hope. It is about the way that ambition and caution war within us, the way that freedom and safety are often at odds, the way that growth and transformation often require the risk of failure, the risk of falling. And most importantly, it is about love, the love of a father for his son, expressed not through overprotection and control, but through the willingness to let the beloved pursue their own path, even knowing that that path might lead to tragedy. When Daedalus finally died, very old and full of years, the people of the island buried him on the beach where he had sat so many times grieving for his son. And beside his grave, they erected a simple stone monument, with words inscribed upon it that Daedalus himself had composed in his later years, words that seemed to capture both the tragedy and the transcendence of the story that had defined his life. The inscription read, "Here lies Daedalus, master craftsman, who gave his son wings, knowing full well the danger they contained, because the gift of freedom was more precious than the guarantee of safety. And here too lies the memory of Icarus, who flew toward the sun with the audacity of youth, who reached for heights that should have been unreachable, who died pursuing his dreams rather than living a half-life in captivity. Let all who pass this place remember that there are worse fates than death. There is the slow suffocation of the spirit, the gradual dimming of possibility, the acceptance of imprisonment as the price of safety." And the inscription ended with words that seemed to encompass all the wisdom Daedalus had accumulated over his long life. Between the earth and the sun, between safety and freedom, between caution and courage, lies the path that each of us must walk. And what of the wings themselves? What became of the miraculous creation that had made human flight possible? Legend tells us different versions of the story. Some say that the wings Daedalus had been wearing when he fled Crete were preserved by him, kept as a memorial to his son, a reminder of both the greatest triumph and the greatest tragedy of his life. Others say that he destroyed them in his grief, could not bear to look upon them, could not bear the reminder of what they had cost. Still others suggest that the wings were discovered by others used to attempt further flights, though whether these attempts succeeded or failed, the ancient texts do not clearly tell us. But perhaps the most important truth about the wings is not what happened to them physically, but what they represented, what they continue to represent. The wings were not merely a tool of escape, not merely a mechanical solution to a practical problem. They were a symbol of human ambition, of the eternal desire to transcend limitations, to reach beyond the boundaries that nature and circumstance seem to have set for us. They were a symbol of possibility, of the miraculous potential that lies dormant in human ingenuity and human determination. And they were a symbol of danger, not just the danger of flying too high toward the sun, but the danger inherent in any great ambition, the danger that comes when we reach beyond our grasp, the danger that all growth and transformation necessarily contain. For there is no growth without risk, no transcendence without the possibility of failure, no freedom without the possibility of falling. As you lie in the darkness now, dear listener, as sleep begins to claim you and your mind begins to drift into the realm of dreams, think for a moment about the story of Icarus and Daedalus. Think about what it means to be free and what it costs to be free. Think about the delicate balance between reaching for the heights and staying grounded in reality, between following your dreams and heeding the wisdom of those who have gone before you, between the courage to fly and the wisdom to know your limits. Think about the love between parent and child, that strange and complicated love that must ultimately release the one it loves, that must allow the beloved to make their own mistakes, that must accept that we cannot control the outcomes of those we care for most. Think about the way that our greatest triumphs and our greatest tragedies are often intertwined, the way that the same action that frees us might also endanger us, the way that life rarely offers us clear choices between good and evil, but instead forces us to choose between different goods, between different forms of danger. And as your consciousness drifts and fades, as sleep pulls you down into its gentle depths, know that somewhere in the vast night sky that extends above us all, beyond the atmosphere and the stars that humans have only recently learned to see with clarity, there is a story still being told, the eternal story of the human spirit reaching upward, striving upward, flying upward, forever pursuing that which seems just beyond reach. Some fall in the attempt, yes, but in the falling there is a kind of transcendence, a kind of grace. The world will always have those who counsel caution, who warn of dangers, who suggest the safe and sensible path, and the world needs these voices, needs this wisdom, needs this grounding in reality. But the world will also always have those who are drawn to the sun, those who cannot be satisfied with the middle path, those who are called to reach for something greater than themselves, even knowing the danger that such reaching entails. And perhaps the world needs these voices too, needs them to push the boundaries of what is possible, to remind us of our potential, to show us that the limits we accept are often smaller than the limits that actually constrain us. So sleep now, dear listener. Sleep and dream of wings and wind and the vast sky extending endlessly above. Dream of what it would mean to fly, to truly fly, to leave behind all the constraints and limitations and fears that bind us to the earth. And know that even in dreams, even in the realm of pure possibility, where the real and the unreal merge and blend, there is truth, the truth that we are creatures capable of extraordinary things, capable of transcending ourselves, capable of reaching toward the sun, even knowing that we might be burned in the attempt. The night is deep now, and the world is quiet and still. Let yourself sink down into the darkness, knowing that you are safe, knowing that you are held in the gentle embrace of sleep and rest. Let the story of Icarus and Daedalus settle into your mind like sediment in still water, becoming part of you, becoming woven into the fabric of your being, teaching you lessons that you may not fully understand until much later, perhaps not until you yourself have become a parent and must make the terrible choice between protecting your child and allowing them to be free. Remember that wisdom is not the same as safety, that true love is not the same as control, that sometimes the greatest gift we can give to those we love is the freedom to fly, even knowing that they might fall. Remember that ambition and caution are both necessary, that the middle way is often the wisest path, and yet that sometimes greatness requires flying too high, reaching too far, attempting the impossible despite all warnings and all odds. Remember that we are all, in our way, like Icarus drawn upward by dreams and possibilities, guided by the wisdom of those who have gone before, attempting to fly on wings that are fragile and beautiful and dangerous all at once. And most of all, remember that the story does not end with Icarus's fall, does not end with tragedy and loss. The story continues in the life of Daedalus, in his long years of reflection and wisdom building, in his acceptance and understanding of what had transpired, in his eventual peace with the terrible events of his life. The story continues in the hearts of all those who have heard it and been moved by it, who have thought about what it means to be human, what it means to love, what it means to be free. The story continues in you now, becoming part of your consciousness, part of your understanding of life and its mysteries, part of the wisdom that you will carry forward into your own future, into your own encounters with choice and consequence and the eternal tension between reaching and holding back. So sleep now, drift downward into the peaceful depths of rest, knowing that you carry with you the wisdom of ages, the understanding that comes from stories told and retold across centuries, the knowledge that others have walked before you, have faced similar choices, have learned similar lessons, and have somehow survived and even found grace in the process. Sleep and dream, and let your mind find rest in the gentle darkness. And when you wake, as wake you will, return if you wish to this story. Turn it over in your mind in the daylight. Think about what it means for you and your life and your choices. But for now, release yourself into sleep, into the realm where stories become dreams and dreams become wisdom, into that sacred place where the boundaries between the real and the possible dissolve, and all things seem possible, and all dreams seem worth pursuing, even the dreams that lead us toward the sun itself, even the dreams that carry danger and risk and the possibility of falling. This is the end of our story, dear listener, but it is also a beginning of your own relationship with these timeless themes of freedom and wisdom, of love and loss, of the eternal human striving to transcend our limitations and reach towards something greater than ourselves. Carry these themes with you into sleep and into your dreams. Carry them into your waking life. Let them inform your choices and guide your path. And know that somewhere in the vast mystery of existence that we can only glimpse from our small corner of the cosmos, the story of Icarus and Daedalus continues to resonate, continues to teach, continues to inspire and challenge and question all those who encounter it. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep well and dream of wings,